Okay, I'll make a start, and thank you for all logging in. Thank you for attending this evening's British Orienteering Development Conference. It's our fourth session of the January conference. I'm Rick Gamble, a development officer with British Orienteering, and will be helping to host this evening's session. I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Evans from the Orienteering Foundation, Carolyn McKenzie from Cleveland Orienteering Club, or CLOC, and Mary Fleming as well, also employed as the club development officer, or we will probably abbreviate that to CDO. So using CLOC as a case study, Andrew will first explain what support the Orienteering Foundation can provide with regard to club development. And then from a committee perspective, Caroline will explain how the club came about, shaping a plan and recruiting a CDO. And then finally, Mary will set out some ideas and programs she's currently been involved with. So with three presenters, we'll be busy this evening, and the session will be slightly longer than others, but we plan to finish at 9 p.m. still. So to keep things running smoothly, I will keep on questions. I keep my eye on questions coming in, which you can type into the question bar, and we hope to answer those questions during the presentation. If not during the presentation, we'll endeavour to answer them at the end. So the session is being recorded, and you will be able to view the recording shortly after this evening. It will be put up onto the training and support page of the British Orienteering website, along with the slides from the presentations this evening. So bear with me for a moment, and I will pass over to Andrew as the presenter. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Right, good evening everybody. Can you see my screen?
It's about to come up now. I think I've changed your presenter. Clicked on share screen. Can't see your screen yet, Andrew. That's it, perfect.
Okay. How's that?
That's it, Andrew, it's perfect, thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you all for joining. I've just got to go backwards a bit. So starting with a few words about the Orienteering Foundation. Not everybody maybe has heard of us, but for those that haven't, we're a registered charity with 6 trustees. We operate independently of British Orienteering, but we do work very closely with British Orienteering, and that's to avoid duplication of effort, but also to try to fill any identified gaps. We make grants to individuals and to clubs and others who might apply to us for funding, and up until relatively recently, that's all that we used to do. But thanks to the generosity of individuals through standing orders or donations that people have made, perhaps when they've entered a major event, a cancelled event or a legacy, but also through contributions from individual clubs and associations, we are in a position to be able to initiate projects of our own. And an example from Sunday, this weekend, that one club put on a national event and have said that all of the proceeds, the net proceeds from that event, they're willing to donate to the Orienteering Foundation, which for us is great. If any of you joined yesterday, you'll also have heard of a recently completed project about beginners called the Newcomer Retention Group. And that's another example of a project that we initiated ourselves. So that's a little bit about us, but probably you're more interested at the moment in why we're interested in the Club Development Officer. One of the advantages of being a charity and having our own funding is that we're able to take a medium to long-term view about the sport in a way that it's more difficult perhaps for British Orienteering to do when they have budgetary constraints and the constraints of the funders. And we can look at the sustainability of the sport and ultimately to try and seek to ensure that future generations of the sport are able to enjoy the sport in the same way that we ourselves have been able to enjoy it. But you'll know that there's a membership issue at the moment. The membership's aging. Several club committees have got an increasing average age on the committee. It's not helped because membership's been declining. And also, I sense that many clubs have actually put a lot of effort into trying to get new members and probably a little bit disappointed with some of the results that have come from the efforts that they've put in. So we've looked around and we can see that South Yorkshire and Forth Valley have benefited from having a club development officer. If any of you were on the call last week when Pauline Triner set out what had been done at SYO, if you're like me, you can't help but be impressed by how in 4 years they were able to increase their club membership from 163 to 290. And it's not just about increasing membership in their case. If you can be bothered to do a search by club, for example, under the entries for any of the major events in 2022, I think you'll be surprised at the number of SYO entries. And so what you'll be able to see, it's not just the quantity of members, but there's real quality in the membership that's coming through a lot of hard work. And in the Orienteering Foundation, we can see other clubs benefiting from focusing on the longer term development. But the problem is that many club volunteers are already stretched. Clubs may even have money, but not quite know how to utilize the money to make the progress that they wish to make. So what we did was, we've got funds to support the engagement of CDOs. It seemed like a productive area given the success of SYO and FVO, but we wanted to test it. And to do that, we wanted to go with one project initially to see if the idea had legs. And so we advertised for club applicants for a pilot project. I'm pleased to say we got 2 very good applications, out of which Clock were successful. But even the club that wasn't successful, we were able to fund a particular part of the project that they are now implementing. So their time invested in the application, I think, was worthwhile as well. So with Clock, we've agreed to part fund the engagement of a CDO for Clock for up to 2 years. And as long as there are some interim milestones that appear to be reasonably on track, we would be very confident that that project will go its duration. And it doesn't rule out the project being extended either if the results and the interest justifies it. So what we were hoping for with the club development officers is, since the initial indications were encouraging, we can see them as a way forward, and we want to help other clubs where we can. What we've done is we've earmarked or sort of set aside monies for a few years going forward to be specifically available for projects involving club development officers, such as the interest that we have in this particular area. We're very pleased that British Orienteering is supportive, which is always extremely helpful. And the development team in Matlock have already started collating best practice tools from CDO projects that have taken place so far. That's got the benefit, I think it'll avoid reinventing the wheel, and it'll be a whole range of different documents like contracts and other different tools. And you'll hear a little bit more about some of those from Caroline. We're mindful that the successful projects, if there is a lot of interest in this area, Caroline and Mary could be inundated with clubs wanting to pick their brains and get documents and things. So having a central repository should hopefully mean that they'll be able to concentrate on actually the development of the club rather than interacting with lots of other clubs, if that makes sense. The most important slide is probably the next one, I think, that you might be most interested in. It's what do we look for when we consider CDO applications? So I'll spend slightly longer on this one. I think the first thing to comment on is that there's no single approach that we're following for club development officers. So a club might want to target families, they might want to target juniors, they might want to target people in the 20s to 30s. It really doesn't matter what the target is, because what we'll do is consider each application as if it's a segregated application and just look at it and evaluate it on its own merits. So it's not against a benchmark of what any other club has done, for instance. But there are some things that the initial indications suggest are likely to lead to a good CDO project. And so being a charity, we have to be sure we're using our funds wisely. And so things to consider really are, is there a strong commitment from the club? Do we see evidence of that? If it's one individual's vision and brainstorm and they're going to be responsible for all of it themselves, I think we would feel that's less likely to be successful and have more risks associated with it. So we're looking for good commitment from the club. Clear objectives, that probably goes without saying. Perhaps less obvious is it's quite helpful for us because we're providing funding over a period of time if there's some interim milestones. So what do I mean by that? I mean, I think it's worth asking yourself, what would good look like? In other words, what would you think would be successful? What are you trying to achieve? How many new members or how many additional participant runs over what period of time? What are some interim targets that you're seeking to achieve so that you can get a feel for whether the project appears to be on track or not, and if it's the latter, to be able to make some changes before it's too late. Another indication is that we find a sound project plan is basically a well thought through plan with club commitment is probably more likely to be successful than if it can't be articulated particularly well as to what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to achieve it. On the financial aspects, we're quite interested in understanding what the costs are going to be, what income will come from the project itself, what income will come from the club, and what funding are you seeking from either the Orienteering Foundation, or have you approached any other entities who might be available and willing to provide funding? All of that will be considered in terms of the finances. And then the last item we look at, and these are the main things we look at, is how likelihood is it that if you really make progress and develop the club, how likely is that to be sustainable? So what's the plan to retain the new members that have come through? And that links back to some extent into yesterday's presentation by Neil Cameron on, newcomer retention group and some of the steps that can be done there. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour for how we in the Orienteering Foundation are looking at applications for CDOs, or will be looking at them going forward. But the most important message I can leave you with is that the Orienteering Foundation is very interested in this area. We think it's probably one of the projects that's most likely to be successful in anything that we do. And so obviously we'll be taking a close interest in how the clock project progresses. And we really do hope we can receive applications for further support towards a CDO from other clubs in the country. And so if it's right for you, do please consider it. We hope committees will look at it and obviously form your own view as to whether this could be beneficial. So with that, I'll now pass over to Caroline.
Well, thank you, Andrea. I've got actually a question, if you don't mind answering, before I pass on to
Yeah.
Caroline. I've got a question here. An interest, I don't know if it's a question or a statement really, but do you think it is possible that maybe clubs who are not wholly in favour of a club development officer are maybe the ones who most need it?
It's an interesting comment, but I think it's one for the club to consider. There's a little bit of an element of taking a horse to water. There's got to be, I think, a bit of a pull from us for funding and an interest to get funding rather than us try and push this to a club. So we're just waiting to hear from clubs, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's not as if you're going to force anything on anybody. It's the club's up to the club to apply and
we've not got unlimited
and
funds, so we want to, yeah. We're not sitting on a huge amount.
And just one other thing here, regarding sort of setting objectives and milestones, sort of what sort of benchmarks, suppose that the benchmarks to start with, I guess they're based on what the project is. For example, if it's raising membership, obviously the benchmark will be the present membership, and so that would have to be very clear when you're setting out objectives and milestones.
That's right, I think, Rick. It's looking at what the present position is and saying, with this project, with this additional funding, we think we can take it from X to Y. And it's up to clubs, I think, to determine what Y is. Obviously, it needs to be a sufficiently significant change to justify the funding and to justify the amount of effort that the club is going to put in. You know, you wouldn't need funding to grow your membership from 73 to 75. So we are looking for those clubs that really want to make a bit of a step change in terms of what they're doing. And the other comment I would make, of course, is that increasing membership in due course in the longer term will lead to increasing volunteers, and increasing volunteers in itself will help with the further sustainability of the club and all sorts of other things. Because many clubs at the moment, their big issue is I think not really struggling to find all the volunteers for the things that they'd like to do.
And just another thing, quite a few questions coming in here, if you don't mind, Andrew, answering these now, because do you need to do a presentation as well as a written submission, or is a written submission enough?
So there's an application form on the Orienteering Foundation website. It's a sort of fairly straightforward, it's got some headings. I think for a CDO project, many clubs would do a separate written submission which sets out the things they want to convey and then just cross-refer from the application form to their written submission. And I've tried to set out, I think, what might be helpful to include in the submission in your thinking.
And thank you. What about efforts shared between clubs? Is there any, say, smaller clubs to adjacent clubs, would it be possible to do a shared application?
Absolutely. We're very flexible in that regard. It could be a shared application. It could be an application from a club and a third party, for instance. As long as it's developing orienteering in the UK, then we can look at any application. But if you're unsure as to whether what you're thinking is going to be appropriate for an application, you can always sort of email to the administrator and that'll come through to at least one of the trustees, and we can give you a little bit of a early indication as to whether that appears to be something that's worth your effort, or whether there's a particular issue that you need to address in the application because of how you're putting it together, for instance. That sort of thing we can provide.
Brilliant. And I've got a few more coming in. If a club applies and is unsuccessful, what feedback would they receive? Would you welcome further application from them, or future application?
Yes, we try and give clubs an indication of why a project was not successful. In some cases, we might take a project and actually quite like it, but doesn't quite get the hurdle the first time, in which case we might go back to the club and indicate where we see the issues, and the club may wish to resubmit the application. But even if an application has been turned down, it probably would need a significant change. But if an application has been turned down, we don't have a rule that says a club can't apply twice in 12 months like some charities have, or anything like that. We take each one on its merits at the time.
Brilliant. It is another question. Is it perceived positively for applicants to be seeking other sources of funding as well as the Orienteering Foundations?
It would be seen positively if a club had managed to secure additional funding from elsewhere. It means that the money that's needed for the project as a whole is not being focused entirely on either the club or the Orienteering Foundation, or a combination of the two of us. And sometimes having a third party willing to provide funding can actually come with other benefits that could help with the delivery of the project, such as, some communication with community groups or other things like that. So yeah, it definitely would be seen as a significant advantage, but we're well aware that for many clubs that may not be practical.
Thank you. Another question here: is it possible to see applications from clubs in the previous applications?
We can provide quite a lot of information. In the central repository, there'll be various documents that'll be extremely helpful. It's ultimately up to a club as to whether they wish to share their application with the central British Orienteering team. That's a club decision. It wouldn't be appropriate for us, the Orienteering Foundation, to share applications that we've received from other clubs. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it gives you a flavour of what help is available to clubs. I think I would start with the central repository, and Rayan Samat is the controller, coordinator, whatever you like, of that, and see how much that helps you.
Thank you. And here's a quick one, just checking that you cover all 4 nations within the United Kingdom. It's
Absolutely.
Not just Wales. Yeah. So just wanted to double confirm that. And last question before I pass over to Caroline. And roughly how much funding is required to employ a CDO for a year? Maybe it depends on obviously how many days or hours they work, but
I don't want to steal Caroline's thunder, so I'll leave that one for Caroline to give some of her thoughts on.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Andrew, then, and I'll get myself organised here and pass the presenting over to Caroline. Thank you very much. Okay, Caroline, I can see yourself and I can see your slides.
Excellent, thank you. I think I'm going to be somewhat briefer because I've tried to leave a lot of the detail with Mary. So I'm really talking up to getting hold of Mary, finding her, and then Mary can take you through all the details of what we've been doing since then. So that's the sort of experience we have. So what I'm taking you through is really just 4 slides: situation CLOC found itself in, the analysis we did, how we then decided to go about finding a club development officer, and a bit about creating that contract. So really only 4 slides. So the situation we are in, we've probably more typical than SYO. CLOC is a very diverse area, very wide geographical area, over an hour to drive north, south, west, east. We've got some fantastic mappers, planners, controllers in our club, very experienced guys. In fact, we were about to put on the JK for 2020. in the northeast area, but it was going to be based in the Clock region at a council. So I guess at that, with the lockdown on, we had been doing a few discussions in our committee about what do we need to do next. We weren't able to focus on putting on the JK. What are we going to do about our club? We had found and dug out contacts in SYO and asked them what they've been doing, and recognised there was a difference in their club base. I had talked to Pauline, but basically all of us were getting a bit older. Our membership was shrinking, and though we'd had a healthy bank balance for quite a long time, we hadn't made a real impact on attracting newer, younger members. Because we'd had historically, over several decades, courtesy of Mike Hardy, a very strong development programme, school development programme, we had the odd junior come forward and come up through the ranks from that, but it was a few juniors, not large quantities. We wanted to focus on young adults coming and how to increase that part of our club membership. But we did also recognise we wanted to do more with the schools programme because Mike was going to be moving to the Lake District, and we didn't want to lose that facet. But anyway, so we had a bit of time in lockdown, very positive committee, and when we saw the Orienteering Foundation advert about what about having a club development officer, we thought, well, actually that fits really well with that journey we were on about how we're going to increase our membership. We were very well aware things like park run and adventure running, fell racing, all of those things were doing very well, but orienteering had been shrinking, which didn't add up. And people were willing to spend a lot of money for those entering races, be it just cross-country trail races, never mind all the Ironman and mud races, etc. So we thought, well, we've got to try and do something different. Our club committee members individually had done quite a lot over the decades and not been able to make an impact with the way they'd done it at that time. So we thought, well, let's try something different. Let's go around, let's apply for this club development officer, because though we had some good coaches in the club, we really wanted new approach, fresh ideas, and we really thought there was a chance to change things and basically change gear by doing things differently. So our objectives, obviously, we had a longer list than just the 3 I put on the slide, but we wanted newcomers, the younger people to have a chance to do frequent high quality and orienteering, but we also needed to appeal to that generation, and I think we do know how social media and club image and all of those things matter a lot more now to be able to stand out than it might have done 40 years ago when I first started orienteering. So anyway, we applied to the Orienteering Foundation for the support to employ a club development officer, and that's why we proceeded, and we were aiming the role at young adults. I separately kicked off something around a schools development officer, again aiming for someone who was able to relate to the school kids to employ a schools development officer. But I did that in parallel with the idea of the schools funding that. So in the summer of 2020, we developed, between the committee, subcommittee of the committee, developed the objectives, analysed the risks, and I drafted a roles and responsibilities document with the help of a couple of people on the committee and a couple of other members. So what I did for developing all of that is I did pick on people in the club I know had very good skills in some of these areas. So as an HR professional consultant level, we had a personal tax accountant, and so on. So I did form a small committee, group of us who developed these documents together. And because putting together the application to the Orienteering Foundation was going to use up a lot of, employing a club development officer was going to use up a lot of our reserve funds, I believed we needed to vote on this as a club, not just as a committee. So at our October 2020 AGM, using Zoom, because we were in lockdown, I got a cohort meeting, and actually everyone in Clock voted unanimously to use some of our reserve funds for employing a club development officer. And I think a week or two later, when the Orienteering Foundation trustees had their meeting, they then told us yes, we were successful in our application. So leading up to Christmas in 2020, agreed a contract between Clock and the Orienteering Foundation. We finished off the roles and responsibilities document, drafted the contract, and then over the Christmas holidays, I used a couple of the, that's the right phrase, I asked a couple of the university young orienteers in our club to draft the advert, because I wanted to appeal to that generation for a club development officer. I then took a bit of a punt about when COVID restrictions might be easing, because I thought we needed like a 3-month period, sort of a month or so to advertise, a month to select, and then about a month before someone would be able to start, even though it's a part-time job. The first round, we didn't find anyone we wished to appoint, and so we went through the whole process again. We did decide actually to leave the advert and everything else the same. Obviously, being in lockdown, I'm still being in lockdown, we thought our aims were correct. What we just needed to do was find the right person, and then we would be comfortable with that. Anyway, fortunately, in the second round of adverts, and I should say all my advertising we did was all for free. We didn't pay for any advertising anywhere. We did a lot through clubs, running clubs, universities, Orienteering Foundation helped, etc. Because we thought we'd want someone who's in the community and in touch with social media, etc. Anyway, so Mary applied along with a couple of others, and we appointed her, and that worked very well for us. So in all of this, we didn't have a huge number of applicants. We had a couple of good people who applied. We didn't have any orienteering applicants, experienced orienteers applying from within the Clock region. I should say we did have a couple of applicants from within the Clock region. It wasn't like there's a lot of people in our area ready to be a club development officer, which was roughly what we thought. Okay, so we went for a contract which was a supply of service, not an employment contract, and this is because several of us have got experience from industry and other things, that we thought this style of work, which is part-time and very much self-directed, definitely fits within being self-employed, and would fit within the HMRC guidance of being self-employed. So we chose a 2-year fixed term contract because we thought, well, after 2 years, the club committee would definitely want to reconsider, have we set the right objectives? We need to just change approach at all, and we definitely as a committee needed to have that reflection, force us to have that reflection. So however fantastic the club development officer was, we just wanted to make sure us as a committee reassessed what the objective would be for the subsequent 2 year. Contract is payment against delivery of activities, inclusive of expenses, including mileage. So again, making sure the role is self-employed in their own control and is not being employed directly from us. Again, one of the many HMRC tests that this is a contract, not a contract for services, not a contract of employment. And Mary has to arrange her own relevant insurance, etc. Obviously, all the clock kit, like SI equipment, getting maps printed, etc., all comes from our budget. And the other discussions we had as a committee, and actually at our AGM, is what we needed the club development officer to do was do things in addition to what we as members were already doing. So the volunteers still needed to keep on running our existing programme of events. Video is definitely got to be additional to, and not instead of what we were already doing in our club. So that was all the things we were thinking about beforehand, and trying to make sure that it was set up right. And then once we had the right person, they could find and come up with the best ideas of how we're going to improve membership amongst this 20 to 30-year-old group, young adults with families. So obviously we're at the start of this journey, and Mary will take you through some of what she's done and what she's done differently to what we were previously doing. And I'm very happy to answer any questions now or at the end after Mary's taken you through some detail.
There's just really one question that's come in, Caroline. Thanks very much for that. We haven't really spoken about how much, and what you mentioned, a healthy bank balance, and I don't know if it's nosy if anybody asks what a healthy bank balance is for a club at the start of the whole process. But there's no real price put on a CDO, but I guess it depends on the project, depends on the hours, and maybe it's not the forum to be answering these questions. I don't know. It's up to you, Caroline, if you want to take questions from people on this. Maybe you'd prefer to do it personally, but
yeah, okay. I think I'd prefer to do it one-on-one for the exact details, yes, because it's the exact details that makes the difference. So I did try, when I was trying to set rate, and actually people can see the rate I advertised in the when we put up the CDO and the SDO adverts. We tried to find out what other people in British Orienteering had been paying, but that was for employment contracts, not a service contract. Yes. I did look at what PE teachers for schools were paid. I looked at that range of figures, and I also tried to find out what coaches for orienteering or other sports were paid. I also tried to judge how much, well, obviously at the time, Orienteering Foundation had a view as to how much money they would fund, and we did adjust the hours to fit that. We were sort of thinking, well, this is a part-time job, probably 1.5 to 2 days a week, but no more. Yeah, so I did try and benchmark what we paid. We also positioned it well, we started off with a certain figure which didn't include travel expenses. I then, with guidance from our tax advisor, we then said, no, we've got to include travel within that. So we upped the rate a bit in recognition. Also, whoever was applying was probably going to be coming from outside the area. So, so yeah, that was how I came up with the figures. Yeah, it was mostly pitching it against what agency teachers get paid, because we were looking probably for graduates wanted to have a portfolio lifestyle. That was what we thought.
Lovely, thank you so much. There may be some more questions come up at the end for you, Caroline, but I'll pass over to I'll change the presenter and ensure that Mary can share her slides. So thank you. I can see your slides. Oh, brilliant. There you are, Mary. Happy enough to start?
Yeah, no problem. So you've got it all now.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so yeah, as has been alluded to, I'm just going to run you through sort of what we've got started with at Clock since I've become CDO, which was about midway through last year. And I'll just finish off at the end with a bit of advice for clubs from a CDO's perspective as well. So these were the objectives that I was given when I started with Clock. So the main purpose of the program is to increase the club's membership, particularly in the 20 and 30 decade age categories. This is including those with young families, bearing in mind that there was also the objective to increase the schools development program as well, and the club separately employed a schools development officer. So really for me it was about focusing on, you know, the parents of those school kids or people who've just come out of university, things like that, rather than building up from the school age upwards. In order for these people to become sufficiently interested in orienteering or to get hooked, there were sort of three kind of areas that needed to be met. So they needed to be presented with frequent and fun opportunities to experience high quality orienteering activities. They need to have frequent contact with people they can relate to, and they need to have a sense of making some progress, which is quite nice in orienteering because you can feel that you're making a lot of progress even if you're not physically, because you might be navigationally or vice versa. So I guess So I guess with those objectives, I was given a list of services to be supplied, and a lot of that was focused around doing more activities for the club that weren't necessarily event-based. So like Caroline mentioned, it was on top of what was already in the club's event program. So this would include things like training days, coaching, virtual challenges, orienteering experiences, newsletters and things like that. But that moves us on to the barriers. We did find that although we had all these great ideas for things to put on for the club, we didn't necessarily have the membership base that wanted to interact with those ideas currently. So Clock obviously had a relatively small membership size compared to some other clubs. One big barrier for Clock is the large geographic spread of membership. So it's not like SYO where everyone's in Sheffield and you can kind of get to events quite easily and things like that. For some people in the Clock area, they might be travelling up to an hour to get to an area that's within their club's district. Like it's been mentioned, there's an ageing membership, and this ageing membership generally had a low interest in club activities, excluding the races that were already a part of the programme. Another issue we identified when I first came in was that Clock had quite a scattered public image. So the club sort of displayed lots of different logos, for example, on different materials that were being sent out, and maybe didn't have a unified image across its social media. And what you might see on the website would look different to the social media, would look different to what's on the social media the next week, would look different to what's on the clothing, would look different to what's on forms. So another thing we identified was trying to unify that image so that anyone in the Cleveland area that was kind of interested in the club might see something that the club sends out and know exactly which club they're looking at, rather than questioning whether there was more than one orienteering club in the area. And I guess the other thing, like Caroline mentioned, was there wasn't a lot of, well, I say lowish community presence, but that's not really true because the club has very good community connections, but maybe lowish social media presence. So we weren't sort of trying to reach out into lots of places through social media. So we kind of came to the conclusion that essentially we'd be running a lot of activities to very small numbers, and therefore we identified that we needed to do something to increase the membership, particularly in the target age ranges, before filling the calendar with loads and loads of activities. So that's where Couch to Green was born. And we came up with this idea of trying to create a Couch to 5K style orienteering course that would take adults from having no orienteering experience at all to the standard of being able to complete a green course, with the idea that this wasn't something that was really widely offered in the UK, and a lot of adults would maybe try orienteering but not stick with it because it was too difficult, they didn't understand what they were supposed to be doing, or people might come along with their kids but never really get that interested in joining like the club calendar, because you know you see that their kids progress and their kids are getting coaching and learning the skills, but they're sort of fumbling along each time they come along to do a bit of orienteering. So this course ticks all three requirements there was to get hooked into orienteering. So we had 8 weeks of ongoing activities to then filter into club activities. We had a very mixed age range of people who joined the course the first time round, but we did obviously have people in same kind of age classes, if you will, so they were able to mix with relatable people. We also, like, to comment on that too, we had very mixed age range of all the volunteers too, so the people who were actually coming and joining Couch to Green got to mix with people of their own age from the volunteer settings as well. And the other thing as well was that we were teaching the skills, so we had an aim to capture them and keep them long term as members because they could see that progression in their skills. The course has also been a really good opportunity for CLOC to unify its image and increase its presence in the local community, particularly through social media. And obviously we're doing quite periodic outreach now to a lot of places that aren't just on social media too. So we're kind of reminding people that we're there and we're about and we're doing things. So the objectives of the course were to increase the membership, particularly in the 20 to 40 age range, to increase the longevity of those members by teaching them skills, to mix current and new club members in a social setting as well as in an exercise setting, to provide frequent activities for club members and prospective members, and to increase community profile through advertising and communication. And you will have seen a little bit throughout mine and Caroline's slides, but part of our advertising and our unifying of the image, we created these banners that use some imagery that was already created by a CLOC member for the new uniforms a couple of years ago. And we've now kind of compiled them into formats that we can use on social media or on presentations, on letterheads, things like that. So this is just an example of one of the footers that we've got, which includes our website and our social media links as well. So a bit more about the course. So the structure we came up with, the course was an 8-week course broken down into 2 4-week blocks with a break in the middle. So it started on a Wednesday and then it ran for 4.5 weeks. Then we had a week's break, or actually probably about a week and a half's break, and then it ran again for another 4 weeks. So that included 2 coach sessions from us per week. So it's 1 to 1.5 hours of a virtual session. I say 1 to 1.5 because we did run over time on a couple of them. And then it was a scheduled 1.5 in-person coaching session. So we did virtual on a Wednesday evening, and we did the in-person session on a Saturday afternoon. On weeks 4 and 8 of the in-person sessions, we arranged a race, so that might have been at a slightly different time of day. We tried to incorporate it into the autumn series that we had going on last year, as a way to sort of introduce those members into what it was actually like to come to an orienteering race where there was more club members there and it wasn't just a coaching setting. And the objective was in week 4 to complete an orange course, and then in week 8 to complete a green course. We provided the participants with 3 optional extra fitness sessions per week, which I collated into a planner. And we encouraged the participants to practice orienteering and trail running through these sessions. They weren't something I would say that was absolutely imperative to the course, and there was plenty of people on the course who didn't really take much notice of these sessions, who maybe already had a good level of fitness, but the point of those was to try and encourage people who perhaps wanted to do something like a couch to 5k, but they found they were really like they were just having a mental or a physical barrier to running, and therefore they might like to try orienteering. They might like to have that sort of distraction while they were running. So the point of providing that was to try and help them improve their fitness and build up that standard quite quickly as well. So that was entirely self-paced whether they did that or not, but I have a background in personal training and sports coaching, so that was a good opportunity for me to put those skills into practice and say, here's a bit more information for you about getting fitter and healthier. We charged £20 per part per non-member, with £10 refundable on becoming a member. So it was £40 in total to do the 8 weeks, but they had that option to book it in 2 individual blocks. So we did have a couple of people who only did part 1. And we also opened up the option to club members or people with previous orienteering experience to only do part 2. I didn't open up part 2 to people without previous orienteering experience because it sort of defeated the purpose of the course. If you missed those kind of fundamental skills from getting from nothing to an orange standard, you weren't going to find it that beneficial to then jump in and learn the progressive skills in the second part. And we did actually experience that with one club member who came along who hadn't really built the skills up beforehand. So that sort of proved to us that was the reason why we should keep the course in that structure. And said member has now signed up to do the next course. So they obviously also felt like, oh yeah, the first part would be really, really beneficial to me. So that was really good. So in terms of setting up the course and delivering it, it did take quite a while to get all the materials in place and put it together. So we obviously had to come up with these virtual session materials from scratch. We had to come up with session plans for the Saturdays from scratch, and on top of that, do all the advertising and organising. So I won't go into complete details about everything we did, but this gives you an overview of some of the more important points. As we started our outreach and advertising about 1 month before the start of the course, and based off of some advice we'd had from Bok, we used a Facebook advert as well as contacting all the local running clubs, stores, groups, councils, university groups and other relevant programs, like outdoor ed programs and things like that. And we did find retrospectively that the Facebook ad was the main source of our participants, although it was very spread. So we did have like sort of an equal amount coming from running clubs, from word of mouth. We had a couple from Chimes and other sources as well. But obviously Facebook almost doubled the amount of participants that we had from any of those. So that was good feedback to know that our Facebook ad did work. Some other information that I'd sourced elsewhere was that a lot of the time your Facebook ads aren't necessarily going to have a lot of comeback the first time round, and that the way their algorithms work is that people need to see them 2 or 3 times before they start to think they might buy into that thing that you're advertising. So it was interesting for us to get a lot of participants from that advert first time round. So I'd like to hope and expect that we would see even more participants coming in the following programs that we run through our Facebook advertising. And it's also something that the club could potentially look at utilising more in the future, although I think given the nature of how orienteering works, it probably wouldn't be as successful for like local events or things like that as it is for a course where you're offering a service. So maybe more for something like when the club's involved in a JK or another national event. So we came up with 8 logical topics. So we introduced the participants to clock and to orienteering maps. We introduced them to attack features and traffic lighting, compass bearings. I had a week where I went through navigating online tools, so things like how to enter an event, what you want to look for on the BOF website, where to find events, where to find resources that might help you with things like reading control descriptions or checking them, and you know what kind of social media outlets they might want to follow. So again, it's not necessarily something that was of interest to every single person on the course, but if we're targeting the 20s and 30s age ranges, then yeah, the ways they're going to keep in contact with orienteering and what's going on is by following social media accounts, knowing where they can look up events and things like that. So that was the idea of trying to target those ideas. We then went back to more skills-based activities, so route choice and reading contours, relocating, simplification, and improving speed and accuracy in the last week, and sort of bringing the whole program together to then complete the green course with all of it in mind. In order to then deliver this, we created a coaching focus group within the club, and we came up with 6 different coaches to plan the sessions that weren't races. I put together the virtual sessions and I delivered them each week. So I had a presentation that I delivered each week based on one of these 8 topics. Each one of these included an online resource, such as a game and a suggested VOC to complete that week. So Clock has quite a few VOCs up on their website and map runs already, and we're in the process of creating some more. So that was a really nice little thing to be able to add in and say, hey, if you want to do like a second session of orienteering this week, go try this one. It's about the standard that you're up to. And it was quite amazing actually once I got digging to see how many people have created orienteering based games, and yeah, include some of these for like a bit of fun or some extra like resources in the sessions. So my idea for those sort of originally came from Orienteering Unlocked, but once I got looking beyond Orienteering Unlocked and had a chat with Chris Smithard and some other people, I started to find there was a lot of different clubs or people who'd created some sort of learning game based around a skill for orienteering. So, you know, these were really handy when it came to learning to read contours, for example, because there were lots of games that sort of gave you contour profiles, and it was a way that I could give a visual representation of what I was talking about without me having to create a visual representation, if that makes sense. And then we created a volunteering team for each week. So we aim to have 1 coach per 5 participants. I think we generally achieved that. I mean, we did have some weeks where, for whatever reason, we had low participation numbers, which meant we had lots of coaches, but it was definitely fed back afterwards that it was always better to have more coaches than less. And particularly in those first few weeks, it was fed back from both the participants and the coaches that being able to go around in smaller groups and work a little bit more like 1 to 2 people or 1 to 3 people was really beneficial in teaching those sort of very basic beginner skills and things about how to read a map and learning what attack features were and things like that. In terms of the outcomes, we had 17 participants for part 1, 15 for part 2. I think in part 2 we had 2 that were already clock members, so 13 non-clock members, which was a really good amount of people. We had absolutely no idea how many people would sign up for it, and we sort of, I guess, budgeted for about 20. When I say budgeted, that's more in terms of what we thought we could manage. We had an age range of about 21 to 64 years, with the average age being 46. And you can see the breakdown of participants in just some age categories that I've put at the bottom there of the graph. We had 4 that were in the target age range out of those 17, and we've had 5 out of 17 translated into members so far. and 2 of those 5 are in the target age range again. So yeah, I would say 5 out of 17 is not a super high amount. We would probably have liked to have more translated than that, but we equally came, we had quite a lot of, although the course itself actually went very smoothly, we had a lot of issues in terms of the time of year it was run at. So I would expect that going into this year with the changes we're making, which I'll talk about in a bit, we should see a higher translation of participants into members, which I hope to see anyway. So as I've already mentioned—
Sorry, can I interrupt, Mary? I just had a question come in here. You may be going to go on to this, but so are you considering more than one of these Couch to Green programs per year, or how often would you sort of cycle come through?
Yeah, so I'll come on to that a little bit more, but we're planning this year to run a spring program and an autumn program. So last year was a sort of semi-autumn program, but it did end up getting pushed back into December, which was part of the reason why I think we had low participation numbers. They did dip quite quickly as we went on, and we think that's likely due to the fact that it was so late in the year and there was a lot of other hurdles like COVID and weather and things like that. But equally, we weren't prepared to put it on before October, so we couldn't have got it started any earlier. So that was one thing that we already had in mind right from the beginning, that we would have liked to start it maybe a month earlier, and we'll take that into this coming year. So this coming year we plan to run one in, like I say, in spring and in autumn. In terms of running it more frequently than twice a year, it's difficult because you have to set aside 9 to 10 weeks to be able to run it in the format that we ran it. You wouldn't necessarily have to run it as an 8-week program. You could do it like Couch to Orange, for example, where it's only 1 month. But we found that it was quite hard to really teach the kind of basic skills that you need and get them sort of set into motion as well. So not just delivering them on paper, but giving the participants the chance to practice them and reinforce them within 4 weeks. So it would be more of an introduction to how you orienteer rather than a let's get you orienteering, but let's also develop some of your skills. It does take a bit of organisation, it takes a bit of advertising. So you're already looking at 3 to 4 months in terms of the period from when you've advertised it to when you might finish. So, you know, you'd literally be going back to back to back if you were trying to do more than 2 of these a year in the format that we've done it. And that's also, again, you've got to consider things like we've learned that participation numbers weren't great in the winter as the weather got colder and there was more barriers to coming along, like Christmas activities. And we've also learned that, well, no, sorry, we haven't learned, but I could project that through the summer there's just loads and loads of orienteering events, which means finding a volunteer team is going to be harder. And equally, you might find people are going on holidays at that time of year as well. So that's the thought that's sort of gone into when and how many of these programs we look at putting on.
And that sort of answers another question actually. Somebody was asking, you know, about the take up being maybe lower than you expected, and looking at the barriers. So you've already mentioned some of those barriers. So it's something, I guess, when you finish a project as part of your analysis, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'll come to a few of those again in probably in the next couple of slides.
Exactly. So that's just come up now, but hopefully that will be answered for people later. So I'll let you get on with it, Mary. Thank you.
Okay, cool. All right. So the feedback was generally really positive from participants and from the volunteer team, which we did post course surveys with the participants, and I actually put together a Zoom call with the volunteer team afterwards to try and talk about what went well, what didn't go well, what we might want to change for next time we put it on. So in a way that wasn't super helpful, having only positive feedback, because it makes it harder to know what changes to make. But we did obviously identify that there were issues with the time of year that we put it on, even though we'd sort of pre-identified that. And we, you know, we did have some ideas come out of those sessions, so that was really useful. So just to sidestep a bit, the cost to the club after taking the entry fees, but also accounting for you know, like the map printing and other costs. We were about £260 in profit. We didn't aim to make a profit, we just aimed to make sure we covered our costs. But equally, this being the first time round that we'd ever run the course, we didn't know whether we would make a profit or make a loss, so we were quite prepared for either way. But obviously knowing that now does kind of influence how we go forward, and I think what we've decided is just to keep the fees the same and see how the participation numbers go this year. The other side to it as well is if you factor in the fees of my employment, we're actually, I estimate during that period the cost to the club was about £740 loss. The reason I've included both figures there is because my employment would have existed whether we did Catch to Green or not, but it's important to factor in, okay, what is our comeback for what the club's actually spending. So in terms of what went well, we had really good club receptions of volunteers and offers towards the new idea, which made planning and logistics a lot easier. So the fact that people wanted to get involved and they were excited about a new programme. So I've got my fingers crossed that people are still excited now the first one's over and we're going to get a good volunteer team again for the next time round. This sort of thing couldn't be run solely off having a club development officer. My hours would not cover it for starters, and having one person there to try and teach 20 people each week just would not be an enjoyable session for either the club development officer or the participants. We had a very wide range of skill levels and physical abilities, so we really did need that input from lots of different people with equally different skill levels and physical abilities in the club to be able to help coach each week. So one thing I guess that was maybe quite nice for volunteers is bar the group of coaches that came up with the session plans, they didn't have to come up with the coaching material. They just had to be there on the day and be told, okay, what I want you to do today is teach someone how to take a compass bearing in this style. And then they just had to body up with a couple of the participants and go over that sort of thing with the set exercise. So I guess some people at the beginning had apprehension about coaching because they weren't qualified or they didn't feel that they had the skills. But it very quickly became clear that actually it would just be like teaching your mate how to do a little orange course or something when you bring them along to an event. Again, most of the feedback was really positive. Most of the participants had the confidence and skills to complete a green course by the end. The feedback told us that the course content was logical and well paced, so no one fed back that it was too fast or too slow for them. So despite the fact that we had different paces in the actual participants, we didn't find that, you know, we found that we were able to provide them with challenging enough things each week without it being too challenging for someone who wasn't picking up the skills quite as quickly. We also found that including a virtual session opened up a lot more resource avenues and meant the course could be delivered visually, audibly, and by doing. So there was a learning pattern for everyone in there, and it meant that we could also reinforce skills for a second time. So on Wednesday, things were introduced visually and audibly, and then on Saturday, people would practice doing those skills. So they had like a bit of time for it to sink in and to go back and actually then practice it. So again, it's that all that feeding into trying to actually make these, you know, to improve the longevity of these skills and these members that we then gain. So in terms of some considerations for next course, hoping for more sign-ups, so hopefully we can slowly increase the amount that we can manage. The participation, as I've already mentioned, decreased quite quickly as the course went on. Interestingly, we saw in part 2 there was quite a large decrease in the Saturday sessions, but an increase in the Wednesday sessions, whereas in part 1 there was a decrease in the Wednesday sessions and an increase in the Saturday sessions. So essentially what we've taken from that is that as the course got pushed further and further into the winter and Christmas season, people were finding it harder to come in person, but they were managing to get their on a Wednesday online. So perhaps they were sort of thinking, if I can't get there in person, I'll still come online because I'll learn what's going on at least then. We did have some weather disruptions. So late in November, there was the big storms up, well, spanned most of the country actually, with a lot of snowfall. So we actually had to cancel a weekend and postpone it, which meant that instead of finishing on the 4th of December, we finished the following week, which is partly why we ended up getting pushed further and further into the Christmas season. So obviously for next time around, we'd already identified that we would want to hold it earlier in the year. And then with that weather disruption potential, we know that we need to sort of allow an extra week at the end in case anything goes wrong. But equally, we want that, equally, we would imagine that things, you know, weather disruptions may not be quite as much of an issue if it's slightly earlier in the year. Some participants missed a lot of the Saturday sessions and therefore they didn't really gain the confidence to complete a green course by the end, which was a bit of a shame really, seeing as all of that kind of information was provided, the teaching was provided. There's only, you know, it's a bit like what Andrew mentioned anyway earlier, is that you can lead a horse to water but you can't force it to drink. So everything was there available for them, but if they didn't come along, of course they weren't going to build that confidence. Again, I think really we're just going to attribute that back to the time of year. Another issue I think that came up a lot was that people were missing it due to COVID. So we'd like to hope that as we come out of COVID times, again, the participation numbers might be a little bit higher. But definitely every single week of the course, there was at least one, if not a few people emailing saying they couldn't come because they had a positive case in their household or they themselves were unwell. So that's another factor to think about for the coming year. Again, we're going to look into how we can increase the translation of participants into members. We need to ensure that all the volunteers have a good understanding and capability to accommodate for differing abilities. So it's just about making sure that if you've got someone coaching who's a really big runner, they're clued on about how to coach for someone who's maybe not a runner and just wants to walk, or vice versa. Equally, we need to ensure that the leaders understand the varying abilities of the volunteers and that they can plan and deliver sessions with this in mind. So we're not going to put a volunteer who can't run with the fastest participant, for example. We're not going to ask a volunteer who has sort of a set limitation of how far they can do throughout the day to go in and collect controls. So it's just about making sure that you know your volunteer team well, but also the person who's leading on the day knows the volunteer team well. The accessibility of the course is something that we would like to promote. So we would like to make it more accessible. Again, it's difficult within the Cleveland region because the geographic location is so spread out. So we do find that generally you do have to drive to get to most of the areas that we're gonna use. I did do a lot of work trying to find public transport network into those areas, but a lot of the time the downfall was certain time of day, or maybe the network would be really good from Darlington to Guisborough, but it wouldn't be very good from Middlesbrough to Guisborough, for example, at the time of day we needed. So that was a bit of a barrier in terms of getting to the course. Hopefully, again, once we're out of kind of such intense COVID times, we could maybe encourage a bit more of like a car sharing scheme, or encourage our participants to get to know each other a little bit more and be able to travel together. But it's not really something we were able to do last year. One side that we were able to make quite accessible was to keep the fees pretty low. So I think overall it was, for a non-member, it was £5 a week and you got 2 sessions and 3 optional fitness sessions. So, you know, if you compare that to a training program you can get from you know, a personal trainer or joining a running club or something like that, it's relatively low fees. The other thing that I forgot to put on here, but we did try to encourage our participants to meet in the pub afterwards each week to try and encourage like a bit of talk over the map and chatting about the skills they learn and also that social aspect. we didn't find there was much uptake of that, so I don't think we'll necessarily push that on the next course, but that's something to take into consideration, is a way to facilitate your participants into creating that social network and social connections. And it might be the case that, again, like there's barriers at the moment, like the COVID pandemic and getting closer into Christmas time, and we might find that that's something people are more receptive to in the spring and the autumn of next year. And of course, your last issue is ensuring you've got enough volunteers week to week, which I think we did manage just about to do, but there were some hairy weeks where I was pleading around to try and get a few more volunteers. So get onto that early and keep hammering it every single week was kind of the ideology there. So what we're going to change for the courses coming up, where we're rotating between 2 localities. So we do based the last course around the Darlington area, because we've got a large geographic spread. We're going to base the next one around the Guisborough area. I can't tell you at this stage whether that's gonna make a massive difference for us. So we'll soon find out. But I guess if you're somewhere like a smaller city region, you might find that you don't need to rotate your areas quite as much. Or conversely, you might find that you have people who want to participate in the course more than once, which means that rotating your areas makes it more interesting for both your participants and your volunteers. So we ran the Saturday sessions last time, I think it was from 1 until 3 p.m. or 2 until 4, maybe 2:30 until 4. We did actually have to bring them slightly further forward towards the end because of the daylight. This time round, we're going to run them beginning at 10:30 at the end of park run, because the locations we've chosen have park runs, and we're hoping that we might get like a little bit of exposure from struggling park runners, seeing us coming in and setting something up and wondering what's going on. So we'll see how that goes, see whether that kind of brings us any more interest for the course the next time round. I've already mentioned several times the time of year, so we already had that in mind that we'd adjust that, which will be the plan for this year. I'm going to run a slightly longer Facebook ad this time around, see if that will increase the sign-ups for us. And I also think that it might be worth us adding in some sort of incentive scheme that might be similar to the junior incentive scheme that BOF have for recognition of completing the green course. So, you know, it's not necessarily, you know, something as, I don't know what's the right word, as meaningful as a qualification of some sort, or it might not be as meaningful as for adults as getting like a gold, silver or bronze award for juniors is, but it might be the thing that makes the difference between someone coming an extra 2 weeks than they did last time. So trying to look at how to increase that participation throughout the length of the course, rather than it starting off really good and slowly dipping down. So in terms of what's next for CLOC, we have the next Catch the Green course, which as of last Friday, we had 10 participants signed up for after 1 week of advertising. And that will run from February till April. And then again, like I've mentioned, the next one we'll look at running probably September, October, but it might be sort of between the August to October period. We've got the schools development program with the schools development officer, which will really come into play throughout the summer. Between Catch the Green courses, we've been running club coaching days, and there's the potential for that to continue in conjunction with the next course, because we have got a club member who's going to be coaching the course for the full 6 weeks as a part of his coaching qualification, which means I might be able to put things on for current members alongside Catch the Green. Again, we've run virtual coaching sessions between the Catch the Green courses. We've run a weekly virtual challenge that has a tally. We've got a potential partnership with a group called Rooted in Nature, which is about bringing, I think it's lower socioeconomic groups into nature a bit more, and they're really interested in Catch the Green and whether they can bring their group along to that. So we're going to try and get them involved, get the facilitators involved in this coming Catch the Green with this site to try and get their participants involved in the programme for autumn. We've just agreed to be a part of the BOF Find Your Way project, which again is about trying to increase orienteering opportunities in lower socioeconomic areas. The club is also midway through the process of creating or upgrading or extending 7 maps, which will allow for 3 new POCs and about 18 VOCs in those areas following some council grants. And we also have 1 grant that is still in process to update another map and create another POC. So in terms of, you know, we've found coming out of Catch the Green, we actually have plenty going on now, too much, if that makes sense. And sometimes it is hard to get people along because there's so much in the calendar, but equally it's good that there's lots of opportunities for the members. So just a little bit about my experience joining CLOC and some of the sort of like essential things that I maybe thought of before, but also since I've joined CLOC that I needed to know about, that I needed to be in place in order to be successful. So generally the members have been really welcoming and receptive to new ideas and initiatives, which is important when you've got someone from outside the club coming in, telling you how you should be doing things in the club. You sometimes don't always get a welcoming reception, but that's been essential because we couldn't have gone ahead with any of these ideas without that sort of reception and people being willing to be involved. So yeah, that leads into the next point, is that the volunteers have been really keen to be involved and to coach with these activities. Caroline, who is the chair but has also been my mentor, has been really receptive to new ideas and brainstorming solutions. So when I came back to her and said, you know, like, okay, we can put on all these activities, but if you're telling me that the aging membership doesn't want to do them, am I going to be putting on activities for 2 people at a time? So that's where we said, okay, maybe we need to change the shape of the way the program's going to work for a bit and incorporate this new idea, this Catch the Green into it. And the fact that I had a mentor who was really willing to go, yeah, I think, you know, let's try something, let's try it. We can only find out if we try it, was really essential, rather than having a mentor who was very much like, that's not going to work, that's not going to work, that's not going to work. The club overall is really receptive to new ideas, so there hasn't been, I think someone meant, like there was a question earlier about the clubs who aren't keen to have a CDO are perhaps the clubs that need them the most. You know, I can't answer that question. It really depends on the general program of the club and how the membership's going, but I think certainly if the club's quite closed off to the idea of a CDO, they might well be closed off to the idea of making changes, new ideas, new directions, new activities, and that will eventually mean that the club plateaus in where it can go, unless it's already got a really, really successful development program. So, you know, I guess that's something that has been really stand out to me with CLOC, is that everyone in the club has been like, great to have you on board and love the ideas you're coming up with, and let's all get involved and make them happen, kind of thing. So that's been quite important. And the final thing for me as well was that the club's been really understanding and able to accommodate my personal commitments and situations. So I am a master's student and I also have a long-term health condition. So you know, I think from the offset, the attitude was that the role wasn't my full-time income, my primary job, that my master's was also important, and there would be periods where I might be really focused on that because of when assessments were and things like that. So, you know, the idea was that the role shouldn't impede on the other commitments in my life so long as those objectives were being met. So long as I can say, yeah, I've put this together, I'm here for coaching this week, and I've been really kind of proactive with my planning and my diary, maybe 2 or 3 months ahead, then I haven't had a lot of slaps on the hand if I've been a bit uncommunicative or quiet a week at a time, if I've had something else that's taken up my attention, like an assignment. So I think that's something definitely as a club you need to consider, is that you're going to be offering someone a day or a day and a half a week, and that's not going to be their full income, that's not going to be their primary kind of thing that takes all their attention. So you need to think about making sure that you allow them to have a balance with their activities for the club as well. And I guess some advice for clubs that are looking at putting in these applications and setting up a CDO program is Firstly, walk before you run. So like I've described, if you need to put some systems or programs in place to encourage more members into the club before you start filling the calendar with activities, then do that. We've definitely seen it's beneficial. We've gained 5 members. We've seen, I think, maybe 4 of those members have been along to coaching days, Christmas relays, other clubs, competitions. You know, there was several clock members who were commenting on how many more races some of the Catch to Green participants have been on. So yeah, certainly if you want to keep those members, you might need to set up a program that doesn't have a huge feed-in of members initially, but over time it's going to increase that longevity, and you're not going to be sort of getting people in but losing them straight away. Think about setting up systems for the longer term that are accessible by several members and will survive after your CDO moves on. That's a conversation I've also had with the schools development officer. Both of us aren't interested in creating things that only we will have access to and that will just peter off once we've finished our job. So we're currently in the process of looking at how we can modify systems with the website and I guess the marketing systems and communication systems. And I know definitely with the schools development program and the maps and the POCs and box and things that are all being put into place, it's really important that these things are put into place and not just one person knows how to run them and how to use them, or at least that one person, once they're set up and they're running smoothly, can then teach a couple of other people to be involved so that those systems will survive for the longer term. And the last bit of advice, and I see this so often in clubs that I've been a part of, different orienteering clubs before, working in different volunteer roles in orienteering clubs, is when people are kind of like, oh, that person can't be involved in planning because they don't know what they're doing. You need to open your arms wide open to anyone who is putting their hand up to help or volunteer in any way. Avoid at all costs being negative about someone's skill level and therefore putting them off helping. It might be the case that actually they're not appropriate for a specific thing, but you can harness their skill level somewhere else. And it's really important that you do that because, like it's already been mentioned, you need those volunteers. You need new members coming through to fill those volunteers. New members coming through don't have the experience with orienteering, so how are you going to get them working as volunteers if you're worried that their skill level's not up to scratch? And I think part of that for me is I've already been thinking of, okay, is there ways we can encourage our previous Catch to Green cohort to bring a friend along to the next one, and they can work as a buddy and they can help teach that person what they've learned, and therefore they're starting to gain those skills of, okay, teaching someone how to use a compass or whatever it is. But yeah, there'll always be a skill level for someone, and in my experience it's been really good to have a mix of skill levels, particularly at Catch to Green, because if everyone was a runner or everyone was a non-runner, it would have been really hard to run the course because we had such a varied standard of participation skills. So yeah, just try and find a way to encourage everyone to be involved in volunteering and helping, and make sure your CDO is good at doing that and communicating that, or if they're not, you've got someone in the club who can really encourage people to come along and be involved in things. And yeah, that's about all I have. So if anyone, I know we're at 9 o'clock now, but I'm happy to answer some questions for a few minutes, and thanks for having me on the call.
Thank you so much, Mary. You've got such a thoughtful approach to your work. It's so interesting, and as the thought you put into, putting particular volunteers or particular attendees, I think is incredible. So well done on all your work, and thank you very much to Andrew and Caroline as well. I do have questions for you, Mary. I haven't ignored them. Some of them I didn't answer whilst you were talking because I knew you were going to probably answer them later on. So so I can skip some of them. Some of the questions were regarding where you did the physical in-person sessions. Were they mainly forests or open areas? Were there any urban areas, or was it a mix?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would probably, I think, to be honest with you, it's down to everyone's own interpretation what they want to put together. This program has largely been built on the way I think someone should learn to orienteer, which I like to hope, given my background and my skill level, would be logical, but it might not agree with what other people would do. And I certainly wanted to get lots of club coaches involved to have feedback from them about, you know, what they also felt was really important. And I guess, in my opinion, I think the logical place to teach someone to orienteer would be on a park or a forested map and not an urban map, because there's a lot of skills that you, like, you know, for example, you're not necessarily going to use compass bearings on an urban map. So that's a really essential skill to learn orienteering that you won't get on an urban area. I think if you're talking about getting up to a really high level with orienteering, then yes, they are two very different types of orienteering. But in terms of teaching a beginner, it's usually easier to, well, maybe harder to learn in a forest, and then easier to interchange those skills into an urban area. So for that reason, we started off in a park, South Park in Darlington, which allowed, you know, it was mostly a yellow map, for example, if you're looking at it visually, but it allowed a bit of vegetation changes, allowed us to do compass bearings. It showed a few features that you'd see on an urban map. And then for the second half, we moved to a woodland, South Burdon Woods. And this kind of natural progression from kind of quite an easy area onto what was still an easy area, but slightly more difficult, worked really well. So we've decided to continue that the second time round. So when we base around sort of the Gearsborough, Stockton, Middlesbrough area, we're going to start in Preston Park, and then we'll move on to Flats Lane for the second half of the course.
Brilliant. I'm just going to take these questions as they come, so they're about one topic to the next, if you don't mind. You mentioned about sort of social media and how it sort of seemed to attract more people. Did you do any paid social media adverts?
Yeah, so we ran a paid advert, I think it was for 3 weeks before the last course, and this time I've set it up for about 5 weeks before the course. And that advertises across our Facebook and our Instagram, because they're connected, so you can just set up one advert for the both. And in terms of all of the detail of the ad, to be honest with you, it's a bit trial and error. Me and Caroline discussed what we'd be happy to spend on an ad, and that's how I decided how long it would run for and how much I would spend on it per day. And I just played around with the kind of, you know, you get the option with Facebook to play around with the expense, and it gives you how many people that ad will be visible to per day and how many click-throughs you should get to your website. So to be honest with you, that was as much influence as I had for that was purely on how much we were happy to spend on it. And I guess by luck, it happened to end up giving us about the number of people we wanted on the first course. So that's, yeah, my suggestion for that is it's definitely been beneficial for this course. The reason I said I don't know how beneficial it would be for like an event, for example, is because part of the advertisement or part of the algorithm is you set who you want to see it. So like target age ranges, you set hashtags that people are interested in. So I set things like orienteering, running, trail running, adventure, outdoors, navigation, all these sort of buzzwords that related to people who might be interested in orienteering. You set the localities of where you want these people to be. So we're obviously advertising actually to a lot of non-orienteers, I would like to hope. If we're only advertising to orienteers in other parts of the country, we've got a bit of a problem. So I think, you know, depending on how you set up your algorithm, I guess it could be useful for events, but you might find that they're not so, you know, how well does Facebook know orienteering communities and is able to advertise to them? So it'd be interesting to go forward and try it for some bigger events and see if that helps as well. I guess the other side is most orienteers around the country know what big events are coming up, so you're probably going to capture much of your audience just from word of mouth anyway. Sticking
with social media a wee bit, obviously the pub idea sort of didn't work out. Maybe it was because of COVID or whatever reasons. Did you use any sort of social media, like maybe a WhatsApp group, to connect people, or No.
I didn't, and it's something that I'm going to propose for this next course. I was a little bit mindful of not intruding on people's lives, and I guess also that thing of not wanting yet another WhatsApp group. I think most of us know that story. Sorry, but I did find that sometimes communication could be a little bit difficult, especially if there was a last minute change to the program, like when the weather went really bad and we had to cancel that week. So it's something that I'm definitely going to propose for the next round for the participants to join if they want to join, and the volunteers. And I think also it's really beneficial thing to set up for your different kind of social groups within your club going forward anyway. So I think that's something we will look into over the coming years, is trying to set up maybe like a 20s to 30s age range WhatsApp group. I think we've got one for car sharing, or we've got a Facebook group for car sharing already. I think we've got a WhatsApp group for mappers or planners. So, you know, there's a couple of target groups there in the club already that, you know, pave the way for setting those social groups and communication groups a little bit. And certainly Catch the Green is one that I'll be looking to add to that.
Yeah. What somebody's asked, what platform did you use for the online? These online sessions were sort of 1 hour, but maybe stretched it a wee bit. But
yeah, that's a good question actually. That's a hurdle I've been trying to figure out how to overcome, because I used Microsoft Teams, and Microsoft Teams have only recently introduced their 1 hour limit. So, you know, you've always got that option of clocking out and then clocking back in with everyone once you go past the hour. But generally we wouldn't have needed that. I would say it was only the first 2 sessions that really ran much over, and that's because you've got a lot to introduce. You know, you're introducing the club and you're trying to say to people, this is how you read a map, and these are the people you need to go to, and this is where you can get the information. And once you've got through that first session of this is everything you need to know, you can generally get your content across within an hour. But yeah, I used Microsoft Teams and then put together a Google presentation each week.
Brilliant. So going back to sort of the where you ran these things, were there any access costs with regards to the places you chose to use? The parks for the first?
Yeah, we chose to use those places because they didn't have access costs. Which has kind of been one of our, like, you know, when we've been brainstorming, okay, where would be a good setting, that was one of the criteria was, you know, we want to keep the cost of the course low. And I guess another thing that helped was we didn't classify the course as events, we classified them as coaching activities. So, you know, for some areas across the country, you do have to pay access costs for events, but not for coaching activities.
And did you set out electronic punching, or sometimes just kites, or?
We just set out kites for the coaching weeks, and then obviously the race on week 4 and the race on week 8 had SI.
Okay, super. And somebody's asked about your background. Have you an orienteering background, and what attracted you to this role?
Yeah, so I grew up in Australia. I've been living in the UK for about 6 years. And I've been running in the Australian national team since I was a junior. So I think in 2019, I ran at the World Champs and most of the World Cups in the Australian national team. So in terms of my orienteering background, I have an elite orienteering background. In terms of my professional background, I'm studying biodiversity and conservation, and I did a bachelor's in marine biology many, many years ago. But throughout the period where I was competing, I was actually working as a personal trainer and in a running store. So that was something that I started doing while I was studying my bachelor's and continued on. So I had a lot of experience in terms of like a kind of sport and coaching role and setting. And I guess one thing that probably made me stand out slightly from just a general elite orienteer is that I'd worked with people in a sporting setting that wasn't elite. So I had experience with facilitating complete beginners in sports up to, you know, a level that they were happy with in terms of fitness. So, you know, in the interview process, I could sit there and say, yeah, even though I have had this experience running to this certain level, I also understand the experience of starting out as someone who's starting a Catch to 5K course, for example, which I think is quite important, really. And that touches on where I was saying, you know, you need to make sure your leaders kind of, you know, maybe they haven't had a lot of practice in that, but they at least understand that that's something that's going to come along with this course, is that you will get very varying ranges of skill and fitness levels. So yeah, that's my background. In terms of what attracted me to the role, I just wanted some part-time work while I was studying, and I couldn't think of anything more exciting than to be doing some orienteering work, if that makes sense. And obviously I was able to arrange a program with Clock where I could do that semi-remotely as well, because I don't live in the Cleveland area.
That's brilliant. And you mentioned having the schools development officer working alongside you. I suppose that was you sort of side by side, you could support each other maybe in things, could you?
Yeah, to some degree. We actually haven't worked on much together because his program is set up throughout the summer. So he's mostly been focused on doing map updates and doing mapping for schools and coaching days for schools. So we haven't actually both kind of ran an in-house program as such at the same time. But definitely when I started my role, we were able to have a lot of communication about what he'd already set up and what he was planning, and we're sort of hoping going into the summer that we can cross over some of our events and things like that. So yeah, I think even from the perspective of not necessarily having huge influence on each other's plans, the fact that there is two people dealing with those roles is really useful, because my time has been completely spent up with the activities I'm putting on. So for me as a CDO to then be trying to also develop a schools program would just be unrealistic. So I think that's something definitely for clubs to consider when they're looking at these programs is, okay, how much time can we afford to have a CDO working, and what do we want them to focus their efforts into? Is it a schools development program? Is it a Catch to Green program? Is it just club activities? Is it coaching? You know, and if you can't have it all, think about what's going to be most beneficial. And I think, you know, the schools development program will definitely complement the Catch to Green program when it starts going, because theoretically we should have loads of school kids going home and going, I tried this orienteering thing, mummy and daddy, and it's really great. And then mummy and daddy want to bring them along, and then they want to learn themselves, so they start joining Catch to Green. But it's going to take time for us to see that, you know, we've had one Catch to Green course, we've got schools program coming up this summer. It might not take us until the following year to see those parents coming back into the Catch to Green courses, and that will be our 2-year span gone already. So I guess there's also that realization or expectation that you're not going to necessarily see results straight away, but certainly we'd hope to see some good results by the end of the 2 years.
Well, thanks very much, Mary, for your presentation. All that question come in. You can see the interest from people out there. There are so many questions. I haven't answered them all, but I appreciate the time we're at now. But I have just finally, really, for Andrew and Caroline as well. People have been asked, well, somebody's asked for an example contract for self-employment. I guess that will be with Rhiannon and Boff.
Yes,
but
yes.
Yeah, exactly. So if you can contact British Orienteering, Rhiannon is the person to speak to regarding that. But if you contact me, I'll certainly be able to get that to you. Any sort of the nitty-gritty behind the process. You could come directly to British Orienteering, and we'll be able to get that information to you. So yeah, there's nothing really more from me. There's maybe a few questions which have been answered. I haven't maybe asked Mary because she's answered them during her presentation. Is there anything, Andrew or Caroline, you'd like to add to what Mary said, or anything else to finish on? All very happy. Well, thank you so much. There's been lots of positive feedback, people leaving giving their thanks for such an interesting and really helpful session. And Andrew, you might be busy in the next few weeks with receiving a few applications. Let's hope so. Okay, well, good evening. Yeah, good evening, everyone, and maybe I'll see you at another session later this week or next week. All the very best. Goodbye now.